Hey everyone, it's Bella, and if there are two things you know about me, it's that I love books and that I love being a gender studies major. So since it is Pride Month, I thought I would give you guys a roundup of all of the literature that has really impacted me, both fiction and nonfiction as a queer person. I love being a gender studies major. It has been so amazing. I just absolutely love what I'm studying. Every time I sit down to do a new reading, I always feel so fascinated and I'm always learning new things and building upon my knowledge. I am super interested in queer studies and queer theory. So for this video, I'm going to share a really extensive list of both fiction and nonfiction queer literature that has really just touched my soul. All of these recommendations are genuinely incredible and loved by me. So I think we should begin by discussing the definition of queer. And the definition of queer is so difficult to grasp a hold of. It is sort of meant to be elusive. It slips through your fingers and you can't really seem to grasp a really concrete meaning of it. And I think that that's the point. But if there's one attribute that I can give queer, it is that the essence of the word is to be liberatory. Queerness essentially disrupts the oppressive system in which we occupy and attempts to think radically about how to create a new world. So that is a way that I like to think about queerness. So with that said, let's get into our fiction recommendations, because I know that's what you're all here for. So for fiction, we're gonna begin with a book I actually just recently finished, and I absolutely adore the film for this book, and that is Maurice by E.M. Forster. So a little background on this book. This book was written at around 1913 to 1914, but this book wasn't published until 1971. And the reason being is that this book is about the life of a man named Maurice Hall, and he lives a pretty much normal life, except for the fact that he's gay. And this story follows Maurice as he falls in love and deals with a society that tells him the way that he loves is wrong. This book was beautifully written. It had me hanging on to every word. I have underlined so many quotes from this book. It is just an absolute delight to read. Even though it is quite an old text, I found myself really enjoying it. It wasn't dull or boring. The plot moved really quickly and it is just such a beautiful story. The thing about this book that really makes it queer to me is even though this book follows upper-class white men, the thing that makes this book revolutionary is not just the fact that it was written so long ago, but the fact that it has a happy ending. A lot of really old queer stories didn't really have happy endings, but this book really proves that queer people do deserve happy endings, and I really enjoyed that about this book. I also highly recommend watching the film. The book and the film deal with topics of conversion therapy, and a character in the book and film gets arrested, and these subjects are really difficult to read about, but the book is overall a masterpiece, and I don't see enough people talking about this book. Next up we have some poetry, and that is Fragments of Sappho. I know this is a very basic and obvious choice to put on here, but this book is so fundamental to queer history and queer theory. Sappho is such an iconic figure in queer history that I couldn't not mention her. This book specifically is If Not Winter, Fragments of Sappho, translated by Anne Carson, and I really love this book. I have written all over it. I would really encourage you to dive deep into Sappho's work and really just let the words ruminate in your brain, because they really are such gorgeous words. I really think that reading Sappho is just so magical, because for me, it just makes me feel less alone. Like the fact that these words are thousands of years old, it just blows my mind. And her poetry is just so precious to me. And I think that reading Sappho is just a culmination of queer joy, and I would really recommend you to pick this up and devour these words. Next up, we have a book that I already talked about in my Queer Book Recs video from last year, and that is The Picture of Dorian Gray. As you guys know, I love this book. It is probably in one of my top 5 novels of all time, and I can't shut up about it. I will keep recommending it forever just because it is one of those books that just shaped me so fundamentally as a person. I absolutely adore it. This book is so heavily queer coded, and I would 100% recommend you get the uncensored version because there are so many queer moments that you miss out on if you read the censored text. But I put a particular emphasis on this edition just because at the end it has a section where it shows you where the words have been changed and why some of those sections were changed. I personally think that the uncensored Picture of Dorian Gray is the better piece of literature, and I really think this is required reading for any queer person. It is so beautiful. Oscar Wilde just writes this brilliantly. And to continue our discussion on Oscar Wilde, this is my complete works of Oscar Wilde. I would recommend reading all of his works, not just The Picture of Dorian Gray. I don't see a lot of his poetry recommended enough, and one thing that I would really recommend you to read is his prison writings. If you don't know the history of Oscar Wilde, I know way too much. I like hyperfixated on this man's life story about 2 years ago, and I know way too much. But in learning about his life, I decided to read his prison writings, and he was put in prison for sodomy. It is just super devastating reading these, but I just think it's really important to read these things because it really shows the hardships that queer people endured and how while we have made progress, things really are frighteningly very recognizable and that there's still so much work to be done. So next I wanted to talk about a writer that has come up so often in my gender studies courses, and that is Audre Lorde. I have read so many of her essays for class, and every time I read her work, I am just constantly in awe. She is just one of those brilliant writers that I recommend again and again. As a poetry enthusiast, I absolutely adore Audre Lorde's poetry. She writes so candidly, so authentically about her experience being a Black lesbian, especially the way she talks about identity and what identity means to her has been so impactful for me. So I definitely recommend you pick up her poetry and read some of it this Pride Month. So next I want to talk about a piece of prose that really impacted me in one of my gender studies classes, and that is In Search of Our Mother's Gardens by Alice Walker. If you don't already know, Alice Walker is the author of The Color Purple, another really incredible piece of queer literature. So Alice Walker emphasizes that this is a piece of womanist literature. Womanism is essentially Black feminism or feminism of color, and she describes this as womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. So In Search of Our Mother's Garden, Walker chooses to focus on this image of her mother's garden as kind of this focal point surrounding the essay. And this garden really symbolizes the dichotomy between beauty and struggle. And she talks about the way that her mother uses a flower garden to sort of beautify a space of struggle and to sort of be optimistic for the future. And also how this garden was a form of art in the same way that writing is art for Walker. All in all, I would highly recommend reading this. It is absolutely gorgeous. I don't always remember the things that I read for my classes, but this one in particular has really stuck with me, and I found myself thinking about it all the time. I definitely want to reread it soon because I really think that this is one of those pieces that I could read a million times. It is absolutely wonderful. So moving on, I wanted to talk about On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. I have a physical copy of this book, I just have no idea where it is, but this is another book that I read recently, and it is genuinely, I think, the most beautifully written novel I have ever read. It struck me straight into my soul, and I frankly haven't been the same since. The prose is just so poetic and so raw with emotion in a way that I have never seen before. I really think that he is truly one of the artistic geniuses of this generation. Honestly, right now it is my life's mission to get everybody to read this book because it really is that good. So On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous is basically a letter from a son to a mother who cannot read. The protagonist basically goes through this story story of his life and all of his experiences from childhood to adulthood. This story really reflects on what it means to be queer in America, being a person of color in America, being an immigrant. And this book dives deep on generational trauma and PTSD and war. While all these topics are extremely heavy, I truly believe that everybody should read this book. If I had my physical copy with me, I would show you how much I have annotated this book, and I go back and flip through the pages all the time to find the passages that have resonated with me. Ocean Vuong's writing is just absolutely revolutionary, and I'm so excited to read everything that he writes in the future. Next, I want to talk about These Violent Delights by Micah Nemerever. This book actually takes place in Pittsburgh in the 70s, and I'm from Pittsburgh, so this book kind of has a very special place in my heart. This is another book that I very recently read. I do have a physical copy, but I actually just lended it to one of my coworkers, so I don't have it with me. But again, I love recommending this book because it is just so stunning. This is just one of those pieces of fiction where not a lot really happens plot-wise, but it just dives into the human psyche. It really goes deep into these two characters, Paul and Julian. It goes into their minds and into their emotions in a way that I don't really see done in this particular way in a lot of books. This book is just so unique, and I loved everything about it. The writing is just so lush and indulgent, and I enjoyed every moment of it. And overall, I just think it's a great read, and I would highly recommend it. It's great. So next, I want to talk about This Is How You Lose the Time War by Max Gladstone and Amal El-Motar. This book is absolutely amazing. It is a sapphic sci-fi story. It is only a novella, so it is a very short piece of fiction. In the same vein as On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, This Is How You Lose the Time War is one of the most beautifully written books I have ever read. It is absolutely stunning, and I actually just recently recommended this book to a friend, and when she finished it, she texted me saying, "Oh my gosh, Bella, I am crying right now. This is one of the best books I've ever read." And if that doesn't convince you to read it, I don't know what will. It is about two women on different sides of this time war, and both of these women travel back in time and into the future and leave each other letters for the other to read in ways so that the enemy won't be able to discover their love for each other. And oh my gosh, it is absolutely tragic and beautiful and everything that I want in a book. It is so good. Without giving too much away, this book is so gripping, and the way that these two authors describe this forbidden love story is just so good. And it is honestly one of the best sapphic books I've read, and I would highly recommend it. Our next book is Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Melinda Lowe. This is a sapphic YA book, and I usually don't read YA, but something about everyone's reviews of this book really drew me to it, and I can see why everyone loves it because it is one of the best books I read this year. It just made my heart feel warm and destroyed at the same time. This book is just so fundamental, and I think everyone needs to read it. It offers such a unique perspective, and I'm gonna read you the blurb because I really think the blurb describes it best. 17-year-old Lily Hu can't remember exactly when the question took root, but the answer was in full bloom the moment she and Kathleen Miller walked under the flashing neon sign of a lesbian bar called the Telegraph Club. America in 1954 is not a safe place for two girls to fall in love, especially not in Chinatown. Red Scare paranoia threatens everyone, including Chinese Americans like Lily. With deportation looming over her father, despite his hard-won citizenship, Lily and Kath risk everything to let their love see the light of day. This book means so much to me as a sapphic teenager trying to go through life, and I remember reading this book in almost one sitting because I just couldn't put it down. It really just captivated me from beginning to end, and I think if you're looking for a really incredible and important sapphic book, I think this is the one you need to read. It is so beautifully written and so well done, and I absolutely cannot recommend this enough. Next, I want to talk talk about Loveless by Alice Oseman. I recently just finished this book on audiobook, and oh my gosh, no one can write the queer teenage experience like Alice Oseman. She is genuinely one of my favorite YA authors out there right now. Nobody is doing it like her. Loveless is such a unique book because it truly captures the asexual experience, and every time I was listening to this book, I just found myself relating so deeply to all of the characters, and especially the experiences of the protagonist. Alice is able to weave such a complicated experience, like the ace experience, into this narrative that just speaks to me in such a profound way. This is one of those books that I just cannot stop thinking about, and again, I usually don't read YA, but Loveless is just so well written. I truly think that Alice Oseman has some of the best writing in terms of writing human relationships. I truly do not think that there is another book that describes the asexual, aromantic experience in the way that Loveless does. As a person in the ace community, this book is such a treasure and holds such a close place to my heart. It is so well written, and the story is so cute and adorable. It follows this girl, Georgia, as she's going off to college for the first time, and the way that she's discovering all of these new things about herself and trying to come to terms with her sexuality. This book is so raw and real. I would truly recommend this to anyone who wants to really feel seen in their identity. This book encompasses so much more than just the ace experiences. All of the characters represent so many different facets of queer culture and identity. This book is just chef's kiss. Incredible, amazing. I think everybody should be reading it. Lastly, I want to talk about Orlando by Virginia Woolf. So I do not see this book recommended enough, so I really wanted to give it a space in this video. So in order for you to truly understand the essence of this book, I'm going to read you the blurb. As his tale begins, Orlando is a passionate 16-year-old nobleman whose days are spent in rowdy revelry filled with the colorful delights of Queen Elizabeth I's court. By the close, 3 centuries have passed, and he will have transformed into a 36-year-old woman in the year 1928. Orlando's journey is also an internal one. He is an impulsive poet who learns patience in the matters of the heart, and a woman who knows what it is to be a man. Virginia Woolf's most unusual creation, Orlando, is a fantastical biography as well as a funny, exuberant romp through history that examines the true nature of sexuality. So this book is really special because it is one of the first novels that really explores the trans experience. Virginia Woolf is already one of my favorite writers, so I had to include this one. One of my favorite things about queer literature is the way that we can look back and see the ways that these experiences have existed for hundreds of years. This book is really one of the first novels out there that really provided trans representation and offered an exploration of gender in a way that really was unique for the time period. I love reading classics, and especially when classics do such revolutionary things like this book, I always have to recommend them. Because going back to what I said at the beginning of this video, the true essence of queerness is liberation. And the fact that this book was written so long ago and did what it did, I think is really extraordinary. So I would definitely recommend picking this one up. Alright, so now we are going to move into the nonfiction category of this video. While this section is going to be a little bit short, I'm going to share with you some of the books that I have truly learned the most from. Most of the theory that I read for my gender studies classes are academic articles, and unfortunately a lot of these articles aren't super accessible to the public, but for this video I just want to share some published books that you can find anywhere that I think are truly incredible and are so important and fundamental to queer theory. So the first nonfiction book that I want to talk about is Gender Outlaw by Kate Bornstein. This book really is a classic, and it is so good. This book is so fundamental to queer studies, trans studies, and I actually read this book outside of class. It was recommended to me by one of my friends at university, so I decided to buy it, pick it up, and read it. And this book is so incredible. It really gives you such a comprehensive knowledge, and I honestly think that this is a piece of nonfiction that is so accessible for truly anyone. You don't have to be a gender studies major to read this. This is the revised and updated edition. This book describes gender and sexuality in such an approachable way, so I really would not be intimidated going into this one. This book talks a lot about Kate Bornstein's life and her experiences as a trans lesbian. It is such a good book, and if I start talking about it, I know I'm gonna go down a big rant and rabbit hole. But yes, I love this one. Add it to your list. It's great. So the next nonfiction book that I want to talk about is another book that I read outside of class, and that is Ace by Angela Chen. What Asexuality Reveals About Desire, Society, and the Meaning of Sex. I'm gonna read you the blurb of this one. So this book is an engaging exploration of what it means to be asexual in a world that's obsessed with sexual attraction, and what the ace perspective can teach all of us about desire and identity. This book talks a lot about what asexuality reveals about gender roles. This book is essentially a deep dive into the ace identity and what it reveals about our society and the way that our society views gender and sexuality. This book is so well done, and it really talks a lot about the misconceptions surrounding being ace, and it offers such a unique commentary and contribution to queer studies, as honestly, ace people are really left on the back burner and are often forgotten in the LGBTQ+ community. And I really love this book because it brings the ace community into the forefront, and it does such a good job at representing a community that is so often misunderstood. The last book that I want to talk about is arguably my favorite and the most important, and that is Cruising Utopia, The Then and There of Queer Futurity by Jose Esteban Munoz. So Munoz is an author that I first heard of and encountered in one of my queer studies classes. I have this professor who absolutely loves Munoz and his works, and after completing that course, I can 100% see why. Munoz's writing completely shifted the way that I view queerness and queer studies. I do not think my education would have been the same without reading his work. This book genuinely and truly altered my brain chemistry. It is one of the most revolutionary pieces of queer literature that I have ever consumed. Yes, it is that good. One of the things that I really appreciate about Munoz specifically is the way that it critiques and kind of adds on to Butler's theory on gender performativity. So Butler argues that gender is a performance, but Munoz says that that's not quite enough. And he kind of takes it a step further and says that where else does queerness exist outside of this performance? And what are the methods in which we can look at queer identity? Is queerness identity at all? And how we can see queer evidence in ephemera rather than just performance. It is so good, and while his writing is a little bit more complicated than the other works that I recommended, I think it is absolutely incredible and 100% worth the read. So I think those are all of the books that I have to share with you today. I really wanted to make sure that in this video I'm not just regurgitating recommendations that you've seen again and again. I really wanted to introduce you guys to some hopefully new pieces of literature that you can check out this Pride Month. So if any of these books can make you feel the same way that they made me feel, then I feel that I would have done something important. And if you want to see more videos like this from me, absolutely subscribe. I would love to have you here. I upload a new video every week. Thank you all so much for tuning into this video. If you have any other recommendations for books that you love, please leave them in the comments. Let's have a bookish conversation about queer books. I would love that. And until next time, I hope you guys have a wonderful Pride Month.